While the actual vote count is still hasn't started yet, early projections are already raising important questions. What do they tell us about the public mood? Which regions proved decisive? And what could tonight's results mean for the country's political future? For more, we now turn to Professor Mason Richey tonight. Welcome, Professor Richey.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Why don't we start with your overall assessment of these exit poll results we just watched?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say, of course, is that these are just projections. We don't have the votes counted yet, so we should, of course, be circumspect in what we think.
Right.
When I was on earlier today, before the exit polls came out, I was asked sort of what would constitute a big victory for the Democratic Party, and I said, 11 or 12 of the major 16 governorships and mayor races going DP would be a good start. I think they probably need to get Seoul. Busan would be nice. Winning Daegu or Daegu being extremely close would also be a victory, and then defending most of their 13 by-election seats. And it looks like right now what we're seeing is that it's trending in that direction. We see it looks like 14 right now of the major races have been called or projected to go towards the DP. And several of those, 4 or 5, are probably too close to call. It looks like the PPP right now is only slated to win 1 definitively. So. If things hold, you're going to have a very blue map in South Korea going forward. So that's the first sort of overall thing. Of course, it looks like Chung is likely to win Seoul, again, based on the projections so far, which, of course, I said is a sort of absolute minimum, I think, for the DP to really claim a decisive victory.
Right.
When you're looking at the turnout numbers, 57.4% currently, will edge up close to 60. So we're already well above where we've been, all except for 2018 in terms of turnout. And most people thought that the higher the turnout would be, probably the better that would be for the DP, which seems to be the case right now. And so I think what you've got is that the DP is supporting their party, they're supporting their president, and the PPP is fractured, and probably some of their voters have chosen to stay home. So it's really, in some sense, not a huge surprise.
Many observers describe this election as the first nationwide, political test of the Lee Jae Myung administration. Now, based on your answer just now, I guess these exit poll numbers are suggesting that voters are giving, a sense of confidence to the current government rather than sending a warning signal. It
seems to be, again, maybe I should say just every answer is going to start with the same thing, which is these are just projections. We don't have the final numbers yet.
It's going to take hours.
But at least for what we're seeing right now, yeah, I think essentially two things are true simultaneously. The PPP is fractured and in disarray, and they're having difficulty motivating their voters because they don't have a coherent message. We can come back to that. But looking at the DP, who seem to be the winners coming out of this, they sort of ran, I think, on 4 planks. The first of which is Lee Jae Myung sitting at roughly 60% popularity a year into his mandate as president is an historic high. And even though, in some sense, weirdly enough, Lee Jae Myung is not personally popular, his presidency is popular. So they seem to be running on that. They ran on a democratic restoration message after the martial law in 2024, and that continues to resonate, I think, especially because the PPP hasn't really gotten out of that crisis yet, and to the extent they have, it was too little too late. They've been, of course, the DP running on pocketbook issues, affordability, and housing issues and things like that. And so, again, those are things that are important in local elections, and they've tried at least to position themselves as, the sort of party of, economic and social justice in that regard. And then Lee Jae Myung, of course, has, consistently, as well as his party, consistently referred to their foreign policy as being pragmatic, both with respect to Washington, but also, China and Japan and the rest of the world, and the summitry and all of the meetings and the things that have taken place in terms of the meetings between Trump and Lee, I think have given him something to run on in terms of foreign policy, and I think that's been relatively successful.
He has had a busy year on the diplomatic front. Now, with that being said, is it safe to say that this election was about evaluating the government's performance, or would you say, national issues or candidates were more at the forefront over national politics?
Certainly it's impossible to deny that if these numbers hold, that clearly a significant portion of the voting public has decided that they're willing to sort of check the box and say, for right now, we're willing to continue to let the Democratic Party do their thing. I mean, this would, functionally speaking, be giving them sort of plenary power. They would have the presidency under Lee Jae Myung, the National Assembly majority, a significant one, and now many of the governorships and important mayors posts. That's a huge amount of power. I would argue, by the way, that that's one of the things that the PPP was correct, I think, in running on substantively, which is that perhaps the DP is starting to get too much power, and that as we say, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that you need a functional counterweight. But unfortunately, the problem is the PPP is a very imperfect messenger of democratic accountability because they never really, frankly, overcame or even showed adequate remorse, much less reform, after the martial law incident. So they're a very imperfect messenger in terms of being a democratic counterweight to potential power overreach by Lee Jae Myung and the Democratic Party. And the party is fractured, and it's unable to motivate its voters to go out. And in many respects, the PPP doesn't have a very positive-looking message. It has a very backward-looking message and a very internally facing set of divisions, I think, that are really something that the voters punished, seemingly, by the numbers that we've seen so far during this local election.
Unfortunately, that is one of the weaknesses and hurdles that the PPP still has to overcome at the moment. Now, Professor Richey, there are so many key battlegrounds, Seoul, Busan, Daegu, and these areas are turning out to be in tight races. Which area do you think proved to be decisive when it comes to the outcome at the moment, based on the early projections?
Of course, yeah. The first thing I noticed, it seems like the DP's probably going to walk away with Busan. As I said, Seoul, I think, was already trending that way. Oh Se-hoon, I think, was a weakened candidate. He was relatively good, I think, among the PPP for dealing with the martial law issue, and I think he was actually a relatively good messenger for that democratic accountability message, but I think he was weighed down by the larger problems of the party, of course. And then, recently the overpass collapse, the Hangang Bridge, the Hangang bus problems have, I think, hurt him a little bit. And the housing message, perhaps, that he had didn't resonate quite the way that he would have liked. But looking beyond, Seoul, Busan. Looks like it may go DP. That's a big deal. And really, I think perhaps the thing that's clearest of all is how close Daegu was. And that's, of course, that's the stronghold for the conservatives. And even if they end up winning it, the fact that it's going to be so close indicates that, frankly speaking, their people didn't come out to vote. And so, the message one would hope in the party is going to be loud and clear, and that is that they need to reform and move on and come back with a positive looking message for the future.
Right, Daegu is turning out to be a huge variable. Chugyong versus Kim Bu-kyung, since Kim Bu-kyung, they're also saying they've also garnered 49.9 and 49.1. That is the closest race that we've seen in this election.
Yeah, it's a huge result, obviously, for the DP, even if they don't end up winning it.
Right. Well, Professor Richey, I do have to ask you this broad question. If these results are confirmed based on these early projections, what impact do you expect to see in the political landscape here in Korea?
Yeah, so obviously the Democratic Party will continue on the path that it's on. Lee Jae Myung and the Democratic Party will consolidate political power. This will open the door for them to do a lot of things domestically, I think, with a sort of free hand or a sort of free mandate. We'll probably see fewer shuffling of deck chairs in the ministries because there won't be quite as much pressure for reform. I think, of course, some people will. There's a sort of natural break point that as we go into fall, will be a year and a half, year to year and a half after the beginning of his mandate. You'll begin to see some shuffling in some of the ministries and in some of the offices in the presidential office. You'll see some shifting there, but probably not as much as if there had been a more difficult race or a more difficult outcome for the Democratic Party. And then on the PPP side, I think one would hope, I guess, that this will lead to the reckoning and the reform that has to happen within that party. I think one of the interesting things to sort of look at is what's going to happen to Han Dong-hoon. Right now, he's down by a percentage point in the by-election in the Busan district. And if he manages to come back and win that, I think that you could see some of the reformists in the PPP say, look, Han Dong-hoon, who used to be in the PPP, of course, but is now running as an independent, he won his race on a sort of forward-looking platform that moved on from Yoon Suk-yeol and the sort of traditional conservatives. We need to do that as a PPP as well. If he doesn't win, will the message from within the PPP sort of Yoon hardliners be, see, Han Dong-hoon wasn't able to win either. We need to continue the course and play hardball the way that we have with the Lee Jae Myung administration up until now. So that's a race that I'll be looking at in particular in terms of the results.
Well, according to my colleague Cho Young-an, apparently ballots are slowly arriving at ballot counting centers here in South Korea. So the vote counting has already begun or is about to begin. Professor Richey, what's the key number or trend our viewers should keep an eye on tonight?
I think one of the important things to look at will be how many of the by-election seats that the DP manages to hang on to. 13 of the 14 seats that were up were most recently held by a Democratic Party member of the National Assembly. So how many of those they manage to hold, I think, matters. One of the interesting things will be, of course, the Chokuk race, rebuilding Korea in Pyeongtaek, which is exceedingly tight right now with 3 candidates, roughly around 30%.
Very
Chokuk
tight.
with a small lead. If he wins that, obviously that's one less seat that's in the Democratic Party hands. That's Chokuk's obviously in some sense aligned with the left side of the political spectrum, but nonetheless that wouldn't be a Democratic Party seat per se. And if any of the results come in for some of these other races that maybe take a seat or two away from the Democratic Party, that would at least be something small that the PPP could take away. I'm really looking, I think, at in terms of numbers. Obviously, how big the victory is going to be for candidate Chung here in Seoul if he ends up winning. I think obviously the bigger the margin of victory he has here, the worse the sign is, I think, for the PPP. Obviously, the number in Gyeonggi province was significant. So one of the things that I'll be interested to see there is whether or not in the Gyeonggi province, candidate Chu manages to stay above 60%, which again would I think be quite a significant number
Indeed.
for her as well. So I'm looking at that, and then of course ultimately, like I said, I'm looking at Daegu and Busan. I mean these are conservative strongholds, and I guess the number there is 50% plus 1. Whoever in those cities can get to the 50% plus 1 mark and end up winning those races, I think we'll be able to contribute to a very interesting narrative with respect to how the regionalization of politics this time has perhaps been overturned a little bit compared to the past. Largely, I think, because of the after effects of the martial law. I don't think necessarily that these trends will hold in the next election or the next presidential election, but at least this go around, the martial law continues to be an impactful event on the national political scene here as much as on the local scene as well.
Well, let us see how close these early projections turn out to be tonight. Professor Richey, thanks for coming in tonight as always.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.